The morning they put Maggie Hale up for auction, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas was the color of a bruise, and every man in that dusty square was already counting her worth in cattle and coin before she had even stepped onto the platform. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat at the southern edge of Kansas like a bead of sweat on a hot brow, pressed right up against the Kishom Trail where drovers came through thick as flies in July. The cattle trade brought money, and money brought trouble, and trouble had a way of finding women who were alone. Maggie Hale had been alone for almost 8 months, ever since her father, Harold Hale, had been thrown from his horse on a cold January morning and never stood up again. He had left her the homestead, a modest 240 acres of good bottomland along Bluff Creek, a broken-down fence that needed 3 weeks of work she could not do alone, and a debt to the Caldwell Savings and Loan that was now 60 days past due. She was 24 years old. She had wide green eyes, dark red hair that caught the light like copper wire in sunshine, and a chin that had been set stubborn since the day she was born. She also had no husband, no brothers, no male relation of any kind, and no money to speak of. In 1878 in Kansas, that combination was as dangerous as a prairie fire with the wind behind it. The debt was $112, a fortune, a thing that felt like a stone tied around her neck every time she lay awake in the dark listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. She had tried everything she could think of. She had tried to hire out her land for grazing and been offered insultingly low rates by men who knew she was desperate. She had sold her father's spare tack and his good rifle, the one he had carried since before the war. She had taken in washing for 3 weeks until her hands cracked and bled, and she had still been $40 short. It was a woman named Doris Plum, the wife of the minister, who had come to her door one Tuesday morning with her hands folded and her face arranged into something that was supposed to look like sympathy but mostly looked like pity. She had explained in a careful and quiet voice that the Ladies' Aid Society had spoken to the bank, and that there was a way. Not a pleasant way, not a dignified way, but a way. There were men in the county who were looking for wives, men who had land and money and needed a woman to run a house and bear children. The auction was not what they called it to your face. They called it a social introduction, a community arrangement, but everyone knew what it was. Maggie had sat across from Doris Plum for a long time without speaking. The stove ticked. A fly walked across the window pane. "And if I don't?" Maggie had finally asked. "The bank takes the property in 30 days, Doris Plum had said, not unkindly, "and you have nowhere to go." So on a Thursday morning in October, Maggie Hale, dressed in her best dress, which was blue calico and showed its age at the cuffs, pinned her hair up with the tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother, and walked into Caldwell with her head high and her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The platform was beside the feed store. Someone had put a wooden step up to it, 2 feet off the ground. There were 12 women in all, ranging from a girl of 18 who kept looking at the ground to a widow of 37 who had 3 children at home and squared her shoulders like she was walking into battle. Maggie stood among them and looked out at the gathered crowd of men and felt something go very cold and very still inside her. This was what it had come to. This was the accounting of her life so far. The men were of every description. There were ranchers in good coats and cattlemen still dusty from the trail. There were farmers with sunburned necks and merchants with soft hands. Some of them were decent men, she supposed. Some of them were not. They all had one thing in common, which was that they looked at the women on that platform the way a buyer looks at livestock at a county fair, assessing, calculating, measuring. Their eyes moved across faces and figures with the same professional detachment they might use on a horse's teeth or a steer's haunches. Every man looked. Every man except one. He was standing at the far left edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the rest, leaning against the post of the feed store's awning with his arms folded across his chest. He was tall, with dark hair that had some gray threaded through it at the temples, and he wore a plain brown coat that was clean but not new. He had the kind of face that the outdoors had worked on for years, weathered but not rough, with deep-set eyes that were fixed not on the platform, but on a point somewhere above the heads of the assembled crowd, as though he was watching the sky for weather or thinking about something that had nothing to do with what was happening in the square at all. Every other man's gaze swept across Maggie's face, her figure, her hair, measuring and appraising. This man's gaze did not come to her at all. He stood there in the crowd, and he simply did not look. She noticed because she was watching, the way any animal watches when it feels exposed and afraid. She had been cataloging every pair of eyes that landed on her, bracing herself against each one. And then there was this one man at the edge of the crowd who was looking at absolutely nothing that was her. And it was so strange that it pulled at something in her mind even through the misery of the morning. The auction moved quickly and without ceremony. The bank's representative, a thin man named Osbert Crane, read out each woman's name and a brief summary of her situation, and then the bidding began. When they called Maggie's name and read out the terms of her father's debt and the parcel of land that went with her, there was a general murmur of interest from the crowd. Good bottomland along Bluff Creek was known to be excellent soil. Bidding started at $40. It climbed steadily. Maggie stood on the platform and looked straight ahead at a point on the wall of the building across the street and told herself that she was not going to cry, that she had made her decision and she would honor it, and she would survive whatever came after. She could feel the weight of every appraising gaze in the crowd, every gaze except that one. The bidding reached $90 and slowed, narrowing to two men she recognized as competing ranchers on the north side of the county. It reached $100, $105, $110. Then from the left edge of the crowd, in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the square, came a number, $140. There was a pause. The crowd turned. The man who had been leaning against the post and not looking at her face had straightened up and was looking now at Osbert Crane with a calm, unhurried expression. Crane cleared his throat. 140. Do we have 150? The two ranchers exchanged a look, and one of them shook his head slightly, a small economic gesture of withdrawal. 140 going once, said Crane. Going twice. Sold. The man at the edge of the crowd unfolded his arms and nodded once, like he was accepting delivery of a sensible piece of hardware, and then he walked through the crowd toward the table where the paperwork would be handled, and he still had not once looked at Maggie Hale's face. She did not know what to make of it. She had too many other things pressing on her to spend much time on it in those first hours. There was the paperwork, during which Crane explained that the $140 would cover her debt in full with $28 left over to serve as a household account, and there were the arrangements to be considered. And through all of it, she was trying to hold herself together and present a composed face to the world, while inside she was having a fierce and private argument with herself about whether she had made a terrible mistake. His name was Clement Donovan. She learned this from the paperwork. He signed with a steady hand, his signature neither elegant nor crude, just deliberate. He was, the clerk confirmed, the owner of the Double D Ranch, 12 miles west of Caldwell on the open range above the Cimarron watershed. He had held the property for 6 years and by all accounts ran it well. He was 31 years old. When the paperwork was done, he finally looked at her, directly and without any sort of performance or appraisal, just a steady brown-eyed look that was oddly difficult to read. He had a serious face, the kind that did not default to smiles or frowns but rested in a watchful neutrality that could have been anything. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Donovan," she replied, because she did not know what else to say. "I expect you have questions," he said. "I expect I have several hundred." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but an acknowledgement of something. "I have a wagon outside. The drive to the ranch is about 3 hours. There's time to talk." That was how it began. The wagon was a good one, solid and well-maintained, drawn by a pair of matched gray mules that moved with the steady, unflappable patience of animals that knew their work. Clement Donovan helped her up onto the seat with a brief, businesslike hand that he withdrew the moment she was settled, and then he climbed up on the other side and set the mules moving. And for the first mile or so, neither of them said anything because there seemed to be too much to say and no clear place to start. The Kansas plain rolled out around them, vast and gold and heartbreaking in its October beauty. The grass was turning, the cottonwoods along the creek beds burning yellow, the sky that particular shade of autumn blue that looked almost cold even when the sun was warm. Maggie watched the land pass and breathed carefully and tried to sort herself out. "I need to understand the arrangement," she finally said, because it was the most important thing and there was no point in being indirect about it. "That's fair," he said. "What do you want to know?" "The Reverend Mr. Plum's wife told me this was a marriage auction, that I would be contracted to marry." "That's what they call it," he said. "Is that what you're expecting?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the mules. "I'm expecting what you're agreeable to. The paperwork I signed covers the debt and establishes me as the holder of the land title in trust. The rest is negotiable." She turned to look at him. "Negotiable. That's the word I used. What does that mean in plain language, Mr. Donovan?" He looked at her then briefly, and then back at the road. "It means I needed a housekeeper and someone to help run the domestic side of the ranch. I have 5 men working the cattle and nobody to run the house, and that situation has been inconvenient for about 2 years. If you want to come and work as a housekeeper and be paid wages, we can do that. If at some point in the future you want something different, we can talk about that then. But I'm not going to hold a woman to a marriage she hasn't chosen on a Thursday afternoon when she's had no time to think." Maggie Hale stared at him for a long moment. "You spent $140 for a housekeeper," she said. "I spent $112 to clear your debt," he said, "and the rest is payment for the service." "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question in the usual sense. "Why what? Why would you do that? Why not just hire a woman from town?" He took his time answering. The mules plodded steadily. A hawk hung motionless over the grass to the south, reading the ground below. "There were women up on that platform in worse situations than yours," he said finally. "And the men who were bidding were not all of them decent. I've seen what happens to women who end up on the wrong side of that kind of arrangement. I thought if I could do something about at least one of those situations, it was worth the cost." Maggie was quiet for a long time after that. She looked at her hands in her lap, at the calico gone soft with washing, at the place where her mother's wedding ring had once sat on her own right hand before she'd had to sell it 6 weeks ago. She thought about what he had said, and she thought about the way he had stood in that crowd and not looked at her face. And for the first time since Doris Plum had sat across from her in the kitchen, she felt something that was not panic or despair. It was something smaller and more cautious than hope, but it was in the same family. "Your housekeeper, then," she said at last. "If that suits you," he said. "I'll need it understood that the land is mine, my father's land." He nodded. "I'll have the title transferred back to you in 6 months when the debt's cleared in the records. That was my intention." She looked at him again. He was watching the road with the same unhurried steadiness that she was beginning to think might just be the natural frequency of the man. "You are a very unusual person, Mr. Donovan," she said. "I've been told that," he said, and this time the thing in his expression was unmistakably a small, quiet smile. The Double D Ranch came into view as the last of the afternoon light was going gold and lateral across the grass. It was a better operation than she had expected. The main house was low and long, built from a combination of sod and lumber with a proper roof and a wide porch that faced west toward the sunset. There were 2 outbuildings, a good-sized barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a smokehouse, and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter but showed evidence of having been productive. The fence lines were sound. The cattle she could see in the far pasture were in good condition. The 5 ranch hands were introduced to her as Tom Buckley, a bow-legged Texan of about 40 with a white mustache and a permanently squinting expression; Hector Vega, a quiet young man from south of the border who turned his hat in his hands when he spoke to her, Pete and Samuel Greer, brothers from Missouri who completed each other's sentences, and a young man of no more than 20 named Charlie Webb who blushed to the roots of his hair when she said good evening to him. They were respectful to a man, which told her something about Clement Donovan, because men behave around women the way their employer sets the example. The inside of the house was clean but spare in the way a house gets when it has been managed by a series of people who are passing through rather than staying. There was a good iron stove, a solid oak table, a set of shelves with adequate stores, and curtains on the windows that looked like they had been hung once and never touched since. The bedroom that was shown to her was on the far end of the house from the room where Clement clearly slept, and it had a door with a latch that worked, and she tested it 3 times while he was explaining where the extra blankets were kept, because she had learned that the time to know whether a door locks is before you need it to. "You're safe here," he said, and he said it simply, without any kind of performance, just as a statement of fact. "I know that doesn't mean much yet from a man you don't know, but I wanted to say it plainly." "I appreciate the plain speaking," she said. "Get some rest," he said. "There's no urgency tonight." He closed the door, and she heard his footsteps go down the hall and stop, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and cried very quietly for a few minutes, releasing everything she had been holding since that morning. And when she was done, she washed her face from the pitcher on the stand, lay down on top of the quilt with her boots still on because old habits of readiness die hard, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind moving through the grass outside the window. She woke before dawn because she always did, had done since she was small, and her father used to say she had rooster's blood, and she lay there for a moment in the strange dark of an unfamiliar room, taking stock of where she was and how she had come to be there. Then she got up, smoothed her dress, laced her boots, and went to find the kitchen. Clement Donovan was already there. He was standing at the stove turning cornbread in a cast iron pan, and he had apparently already been outside because there was hay dust on his sleeve and his hair was wind-blown. He looked up when she came in. "I was going to bring something to your room," he said. "I don't sleep late," she said. "Me where things are." "You don't have to start today," he said. "I'm not built for sitting still," she said. "Where's the coffee?" he showed her. She made the coffee and he finished the cornbread, and they sat at the table in the early dark and ate together in a silence that was, she noted with some surprise, not uncomfortable. He told her briefly how the days ran on the ranch when the hands took their meals, what supplies were needed, what the kitchen garden had produced, and what had been put up for winter. She asked questions where she had them, and he answered them directly and without condescension, which was something she filed away as important. The days that followed had a rhythm that she fell into more easily than she had expected. She was a woman who had run a household from the age of 12, when her mother had died of fever and she had stepped in without anyone asking her to, and the work of the Double D's house was familiar territory even if the house itself was strange. She cooked 3 meals a day, and they were good meals because she was a good cook, and the transformation in the morale of the 5 ranch hands was visible within a week. Tom Buckley told her on the 4th morning that he hadn't eaten bread that good since his mother was alive, and he said it with such naked sincerity that she laughed, which surprised them both. She repaired the curtains and reorganized the pantry, and found the seeds from this year's kitchen garden and made notes about what to plant come spring. She mended clothing and rendered lard and put up the last of the fall preserves from the fruit cellar. She was useful and she knew it, and usefulness had always been her version of belonging. What she had not anticipated was Clement Donovan himself. He was unlike any man she had known. Her father had been a gentle man, bookish and quiet, not built for the frontier in his heart, even if his body had managed it well enough. The men of Caldwell she had known were either the kind who expanded to fill every room they entered, loud and demanding, or the kind who shrank from notice and let their wives carry everything. Clement was neither of these. He occupied his own space without taking up anyone else's. He spoke when he had something to say and was silent when he didn't, and neither the speech nor the silence felt like a statement about anything. He treated her with a consistent, matter-of-fact courtesy that asked nothing of her in return and offered no performance of warmth that needed to be reciprocated. And he still, she noticed, rarely looked at her directly when other people were around. It puzzled her. When they were alone, working through something together or sitting at the table over a meal, he would meet her eyes easily enough and hold the look without discomfort. But in the presence of the ranch hands, he kept his gaze carefully to the side of her, never quite landing on her face in the way that felt like possession or assessment. She could not work out what it meant. She had known men who would not look at a woman because they were afraid of her, and men who would not look at a woman because they were hiding something, and men who would not look at a woman because they thought she was beneath their notice. None of those seemed to fit. She found herself thinking about it at odd moments, in the middle of kneading bread or carrying water from the pump, turning the question over and over without finding an answer that satisfied. In the meantime, the days passed, and the work continued, and November came in on a cold wind from the north, and she began to feel the ranch become familiar under her feet, the way a place only does when you start to think of it as yours. She drove back to her father's land one clear November morning with Tom Buckley riding escort, because 12 miles of open Kansas prairie was not the kind of thing a woman traveled alone in 1878. The homestead stood empty, and it hurt to see it, the cold hearth in her father's chair still pulled up to the table where he'd left it. But she gathered what she had come for, the things that were irreplaceable. Her mother's Bible, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, 2 books her father had carried west, and a small carved wooden box where she kept the few letters she had received over her lifetime that were worth keeping. She loaded them into the back of the wagon, and she did not let herself look back when they drove away. When she came home that evening, and she noticed the word before she could stop it, home, Clement was waiting on the porch. He did not say anything about the fact that she had been crying, which was visible even if she had done her best to repair the evidence. He just took the carving of the wooden box from her arms and carried it inside for her, and set it on the shelf above her bed where she could see it from the door. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, as though it was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. That night she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about her father, and about the auction, and about the strange geography of her situation, and about Clement Donovan and the way he had stood apart from the crowd and not looked at her face, and about how she was starting to feel something she had not given herself permission to identify yet. She was saved from having to identify it by the sound of something wrong outside. It was not dramatic, not a gunshot or a shout, just a wrong quality to the sounds of the night, the cattle shifting in a way that was not their usual settled movement, a restlessness in the animals that her father had always said meant something was off. She was dressed and at the window before the thought had fully formed. In the pale moonlight she could see one of the far pasture fences had a section down, and beyond it 3 shapes that were not cattle were moving through the gap. She did not hesitate. She went down the hall and knocked sharply on Clement's door. "Something in the south pasture," she said clearly when she heard him stir. "The far fence section is down." There was a sound of immediate movement, and within 2 minutes he was in the hall with his boots on and his coat half fastened, and he looked at her with that direct look she had learned to read as attention, full and focused. "How many?" he said. "3 that I could see." "Not wolves?" He nodded. He went and woke Tom and Pete without ceremony, and the 3 of them went out into the cold dark, and Maggie stood on the porch and watched them go. She thought about going back to bed and knew she wouldn't, so she went to the kitchen and built up the stove and put coffee on because they would need it when they came back. They came back an hour later, cold and dust-covered, with the news that 3 steers had been run through the gap, and that whoever had done the running was long gone south toward the border. 2 of the steers had been recovered. 1 was lost. Clement came into the kitchen and stood by the stove and drank the coffee she had ready and said, "You heard that before any of us." "My father used to say I had good ears," she said. "He wasn't wrong." He turned the cup in his hands. "Thank you." "It's just listening," she said. "Listening at the right time," he said, "matters as much as anything else." She looked at him across the kitchen in the firelight and felt that thing again, the thing she had not given herself permission to name. And this time she let herself acknowledge it just enough to know it was there before she tucked it carefully back where it couldn't complicate anything. December brought proper cold, and the work of the ranch turned inward. Repairs to be done and equipment to be maintained and accounts to be kept. She discovered that Clement had a small collection of books, better than she would have guessed, including a volume of Emerson and one of Tennyson, and a surprisingly good history of the Mexican War that she read in 3 days because she had always had a hunger for history, and there had never been enough books to feed it. One evening she came into the sitting room with the Emerson book and found him already there, reading the Tennyson by the lamplight. She hesitated in the doorway and he looked up and said, without any particular self-consciousness, "There's a lamp on the table if you want more light." So she sat in the chair across from him and read her book, and he read his, and the fire in the stove crackled, and the wind pushed at the walls outside, and it was, she thought, possibly the most quietly contented evening she had spent in years. There was no performance to it, no conversation that needed to be had or impression that needed to be made. It was just two people reading in the same room, and it was comfortable in the way that only things that fit properly are comfortable. She started finding reasons to be in the sitting room after dinner when he was there. She told herself it was because the light was better, and because the stove in the sitting room was more reliable than the one in her bedroom. She was not entirely honest with herself. He had noticed that she read quickly, and one evening he brought her a third book, pressed into her hands without ceremony as she was passing through the hallway. It was a copy of Dickens' Bleak House, slightly battered, and when she looked up at him in surprise he said, "I've read it twice. It'll keep you occupied for a week at least." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You've been going through that Emerson faster than is decent." She laughed, and he smiled, and it was a real smile, not the small careful one she had seen before but a full one that changed his face entirely. And she had to look back down at the book very quickly, because something about that smile went straight through her composure like a warm hand through frost. Christmas came. She had not thought much about it in advance, had been too focused on the work and the management of getting through each day. And she was surprised when on Christmas morning she found a small package on the kitchen table with her name written on it in Clement's handwriting. Inside was a new pair of leather-work gloves, good ones, soft and well-made, the kind that would last for years, and tucked inside one of them was a small card that said only, "For the woman who does the work of 3." She stood in the kitchen holding the gloves and the card, and thought that she was very possibly in terrible trouble where her own heart was concerned. She made him a gift in return, though she had not planned to. She had been repairing a tear in one of his good coats, and she took the opportunity to replace the buttons with better ones she had found among her mother's sewing things, good brass buttons that transformed the look of the coat entirely, and she pressed it and hung it on the peg by his door on Christmas morning. He found it and came to find her in the kitchen and stood in the doorway with the coat over his arm and said, "This is very fine work." "The buttons were my mother's," she said. He looked down at them and back at her, and she could see that he understood exactly what that meant, what it cost to give those away. "I'll take good care of it," he said. "I know you will," she said, because she did. January was cold and clear, and the ranch settled into the deep stillness of a plains winter. The world pared back to basics, sky and grass and wind and work. She found that the long evenings gave her time to think in ways she had not been able to in the months of managing crises, and what she kept thinking about was that question she had turned over and over since October. Why had he not looked at her face at the auction? She had been turning it over for 3 months now and had not found an answer that satisfied her. Every theory she tried on seemed to fit only partway. She had thought at first that perhaps he had simply not been paying attention, that he had been standing there for his own purposes and the auction had barely registered. But the deliberateness of his bid, the timing and the amount made that impossible. He had been paying attention. He had been paying careful attention. He had simply chosen not to look at her the way the other men were looking. She thought about asking him. She thought about it for weeks. She rehearsed the question in her head while she was kneading bread, tested different versions of it while she was carrying water, turned it over while she was lying in the dark not sleeping. She couldn't work out how to ask it without it sounding like either an accusation or a declaration of something she wasn't sure she was ready to declare. February came, and with it, a late blizzard that kept everyone indoors for 4 days. The hands crowded in the bunkhouse playing cards and telling stories, and Clement and Maggie confined to the main house with the stove banked high and the world outside nothing but white noise and cold. They played cards themselves, casino and cribbage, and she discovered that he was a formidably patient card player who never gave anything away but occasionally, when he was losing with particular elegance, did something with the left corner of his mouth that she had come to think of as his tell. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with a cribbage board between them, she finally asked the question. She said it without planning to, without the careful preamble she had rehearsed. She was moving her pegs on the board and not looking at him, and she said, "Why didn't you look at me at the auction?" The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. The wind pushed at the walls. She looked up then because she needed to see his face, and he was looking at her with that direct, unhurried look, and in it she could see that the question had not surprised him, that he had perhaps been waiting for it. "What do you mean?" he said, though she thought he might already know. "Every man in that crowd was looking at the women on the platform," she said carefully, "measuring us up. You were standing right there and you weren't. Not at me, not at any of them. You were looking at the sky or somewhere else entirely. And then you made the highest bid, and I've been wondering about it since October, and I would like to understand." He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his cribbage pegs over in his fingers without looking at them. "Because the other men were looking the way you look at something you're deciding whether to buy," he said at last. "And you weren't merchandise. None of you were. What was happening on that platform was a system using women as a solution to the problem of frontier labor and social organization, and I didn't have any business adding my gaze to that machinery. Looking at you that way would have made me part of something I didn't want to be part of." She looked at him for a long time. "So you bid on me," she said. "I bid because I could help," he said. "Not because I thought I had the right to possess. There's a difference." "There is," she said. "Most men don't know there is." "I had a mother," he said simply, "and I paid attention." She looked back down at the cribbage board and moved her pegs, and the silence between them was different now, warmer and more inhabited. "It was the right thing," she said quietly. "What you did, and the reason for it. I've been turning it over for months because it didn't fit what I expected, and now I understand that it didn't fit because it was something I wasn't used to seeing." "Which is what?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Respect," she said. Something moved through his expression, quiet and clear. "You deserve it," he said. "That's not a remarkable thing to say. It should be ordinary." "It isn't ordinary," she said. "I wish it were." "I know," he said. After the blizzard, the world came back into itself, and the days lengthened by their small daily increments, and March arrived with mud and the smell of thaw and the first ambitious green pushing up through the dead grass. She found the seeds she had noted in November and started thinking about the kitchen garden, drawing it out on paper in the evenings, planning rows and rotations with the methodical pleasure of someone who finds deep satisfaction in ordering a growing thing. She showed him the plan one morning over coffee, and he looked at it seriously, not dismissively the way she had half expected in spite of everything she knew about him by now, but genuinely considering it, asking where she planned to put the squash and why she had the beans on the south side. "More sun on the south," she said. "The drainage runs that direction in heavy rain," he said. The beans won't mind, but the squash might rot. Shift them north, or build up the bed a little. Raise it 6 inches, it'll drain toward the center aisle instead. She looked at the plan and then at him. You know about kitchen gardens. My mother grew one for 30 years, he said. I know enough. Tell me about her, Maggie said, and it came out more directly than she had intended, but he didn't seem to mind. He told her. His mother had been a woman named Clement Donovan who had come west from Ohio as a bride of 17 and had spent the next 30 years building a life on the Kansas prairie with a stubbornness and competence that he described with an admiration that was not nostalgia but recognition. She had died 3 years ago of pneumonia, and his father had died in the war, and Clement had been running the family land since he was 23. She sounds formidable, Maggie said. She was the most capable person I've ever known, he said. She could do the work of 3 men and make it look like she was just tidying up, and she never asked anyone to notice or thank her for it. She just did it because it needed doing, and she was the one who could. Maggie thought about that. You wrote that on your card, she said. At Christmas, the work of 3. He looked at her steadily. I meant it as the highest compliment I know how to give. She held his gaze and felt that warmth again, larger now than she had let it be before. I understand that, she said. Spring arrived in proper force, and with it, the business of the ranch multiplied. The calving and the early drives and the fencing to be done after the winter damage. And the kitchen garden went in over 3 days of hard work that left her arms aching, and her knees muddy and her heart satisfied in the way that only planting things can satisfy. Clement worked alongside her on the raised beds on a Sunday afternoon, not because she had asked him to, but because he was there and it made sense, and they worked in the comfortable way they had developed over the winter, each knowing where the other was without having to check, moving around each other with the easy, unconscious coordination of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She was tamping down soil around a transplanted tomato seedling when he said, without looking up from his own work, "Your land is supposed to come back to you in 2 months." She stopped and looked at him. She had not forgotten about the 6-month arrangement, but she had also, without entirely meaning to, stopped counting toward it. "The title transfer," he said. "I remember," she said. "I want to make sure you still want that," he said. "The arrangement as we discussed it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly. He was crouched over a row of bean seedlings, and he looked up at her now with that serious, direct expression that she had come to trust absolutely. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm asking if the arrangement still makes sense to you," he said. "6 months ago you were in a difficult position, and I offered something practical. The situation may be different now." "Different how?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. He set down the trowel he was holding. He sat back and looked at her across the garden row with the April light coming over his shoulder and the smell of turned earth between them. "Because I think I love you," he said, as straightforwardly as if he were reading a measurement, just putting the fact down where it could be seen. "And I wanted you to know that before the legal situation is resolved, so that nothing about the land or the arrangement complicates what you make of it. The land is yours regardless. That doesn't change. But if you want to know where I stand, that's where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment, and the morning birds were making their noise in the cottonwood by the fence, and the sun was warm on her back, and she thought about October and the auction platform, and the one man in the crowd who had not looked at her face, and about December and the leather gloves and the card, and about February and the cribbage board and the word respect said in the middle of a blizzard, and about all the evenings by the stove with books, and all the mornings over coffee with plans. "I love you too," she said, with the same directness, because she had learned it from him and it suited her. "I think I have for a while, and I kept finding reasons not to say it." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something open up in his face, something that had been held carefully closed, not from dishonesty but from discipline, and it was like watching a room's shutters come open on a bright day. "What reasons?" he said. "That it was too soon," she said. that I didn't know him, that I had just survived a hard thing and was maybe confusing gratitude with something else. She paused. But I do know you. I've been watching you since October, and it isn't gratitude. No, he said. No, she agreed. He reached across the garden row and took her hand, the one still holding the trowel, and he held it for a moment without doing anything else. Just held it, and it was exactly right, that steadiness. They were married on a Saturday in May by the Reverend Mr. Plum, who was a better man than his wife's pity, and performed the ceremony with genuine warmth in the sitting room of the Double D Ranch house, with Tom Buckley and Hector Vega and the Greer brothers and young Charlie Webb all cleaned up and crowded into the room smelling of soap and nerves. Tom Buckley cried and spent the rest of the afternoon pretending he had something in his eye. She wore a dress that was not blue calico but good cream wool that she had made over the winter from fabric Clement had brought from Caldwell without telling her why, and she stood beside him in the May light and made promises that she meant with her whole self. And when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, and which she had insisted she did not mind, and then discovered she minded very much in the best possible way. She felt for the first time in a long time that the ground beneath her feet was solid and real. The weeks after the wedding were golden in the way that some stretches of life are, when things that were separate become joined, and the joining fits so well you can't believe it was ever otherwise. She moved the few personal things from her room to his, though the room remained her own as much as it was his because that was the kind of people they were. And she put her mother's Bible on the table beside the bed, and the carved wooden box on the shelf, and the photograph of her parents on the mantelpiece where it could look over the room. And the house felt different after that, lived in and layered, the way places feel when they carry the marks of more than one life. In the summer she planted a section of her own land in wheat, just 6 acres to start, because she was not ready to let it sit unworked even though managing it from 12 miles away was complicated. Clement rode out with her on a June morning and walked the field with her, and they talked about what it needed and what it might produce, and he suggested that if she wanted they could hire a man to tend it through the season on her behalf, and she agreed on the condition that the arrangement be paid from her own household account, which he accepted without argument because he was that kind of man. The wheat came in that August and it was good. 32 bushels to the acre, which was better than average for a dry year, and she stood at the edge of the field with the cut wheat lying in the afternoon light and felt her father's presence strongly and gently, the way she imagined he would want to be felt. She told Clement that evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling air, about her father. Not the bare facts she had mentioned in October, but the real story, the books he had loved and the horse he hadn't been meant to ride, and the way he used to sing off-key in the kitchen when he thought she couldn't hear him. She talked for a long time, and Clement listened in the way he always listened, without interruption or haste, just present. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man who was right about the important things and wrong about the small ones." "That's exactly what he was," she said, and she was laughing even though her eyes were wet. "The best kind," he said. She moved her chair closer to his, and they sat together in the warm dark watching the stars come out over the Kansas plain, and she thought that of all the things she had not expected when she stood on that platform in October, this particular combination of a porch and a sky, and a man who understood what she meant was the most unexpected and the most exactly right. In September she realized she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not from fear of his reaction, but because she wanted to be certain, and because she had learned over a life of practical self-reliance that it was better to know a thing clearly before you spoke it out loud. When she was certain, she told him on a Sunday morning over breakfast, plainly, the way they said things to each other. He sat with it for a moment the way he sat with everything important, and she watched his face and saw something move through it that was deep and quiet and glad. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing, which was exactly correct. "I'm perfectly well," she said. A little sick in the mornings, but otherwise fine. Tell me what you need, he said. I don't need anything extraordinary, she said. I need things to continue as they are mostly, and I'd like Mrs. Alvarez from town to be available when the time comes. She's the best midwife in the county. I'll speak to her this week, he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt him holding onto something in the gesture, not possession but gladness, the kind of gladness that needs a physical anchor. I'm very happy, he said simply. I know, she said. So am I. Tom Buckley was told first, being the senior ranch hand, and in many ways the closest thing the ranch had to extended family. And his reaction was so enthusiastic and so immediately practical that within 24 hours he had fixed the wobbly hinge on the second bedroom door, offered to build a cradle, and produced from somewhere in the depths of the bunkhouse a small carved wooden rattle that he had apparently made in his spare time over the course of a winter years before, and kept on the theory that it would eventually be needed. Maggie held the rattle and looked at Tom Buckley's weathered, self-conscious face and said, "This is beautiful work." "I'm a fair hand with a knife," he said, looking at the ground. "It's the first thing in the nursery," she said, and watched him turn red to the tips of his ears. The winter passed, and with it the growing weight and warmth of the pregnancy, and she was one of those women who carry well, without excessive difficulty. And she found that the ranch life suited the condition, because there was always something useful to do, and staying useful kept the small anxieties at bay. Clement was attentive in the precise calibration that she needed, present without hovering, helpful without taking over, checking on her without making her feel like she was being managed. When she couldn't sleep, he would sometimes sit with her in the sitting room, not talking if she didn't want to talk, just there, which was what she needed on the hard nights. The baby came in February, exactly 16 months after the auction in Caldwell, in the early morning hours after a long night, with Mrs. Alvarez proving to be worth every penny of her considerable reputation. It was a boy. A solid, red-faced, furious boy who arrived in the world with the full expression of his opinions on the subject, and didn't stop expressing them for a notable period. Clement came into the room white-faced and shaking in a way she had never seen him, and she thought, watching him come to the bedside and look down at this small person with an expression of absolute thunderstruck love, that it was one of the finest things she had ever seen a human being look like. "He's beautiful," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "He looks like a very angry apple," she said, because honesty was important even in remarkable moments. Clement laughed, and it broke something loose in him, and he sat down in the chair beside the bed and held her hand and looked at his son and kept laughing until the shakiness was gone. They named him James Harold Donovan. James for Clement's grandfather and Harold for her father, and she thought when she wrote it down in the family Bible that it was a name with enough history in it to anchor a person all his life. James Harold Donovan was, from his first weeks, an emphatically present person. He had opinions about everything. He had opinions about when he wanted to eat and when he did not, about what noises were acceptable in his vicinity, about the angle at which he was held, and about whether the morning was going to be a good morning or not, and he communicated these opinions with the full force of his considerable lungs. Tom Buckley was enchanted. He took to coming to the porch every morning on the pretext of having something to report to Clement, and could generally be found, on inspection, standing in the sitting room talking to the baby with the rattle he had made, conducting long, one-sided conversations about horses and weather and the character of cattle. Charlie Webb, the youngest of the hands, was so terrified of the baby that he kept a distance of at least 4 feet for the first 2 weeks. And then one afternoon Maggie placed the baby in his arms when he was sitting on the porch step with no warning at all, and he sat absolutely rigid with terror for about 30 seconds, and then James Harold sneezed, and Charlie Webb dissolved into laughter, and that was the end of the distance. Spring came again, and James Harold became mobile in the terrifying way that babies become mobile, pulling himself along the floor with the focused determination of a small general. And the ranch adapted around him the way a good community adapts around any new member, with accommodation and affection, and the occasional panicked grab when he approached something dangerous. Maggie walked her own land in the April sunshine with the baby on her hip, and she showed him the field that had been planted in wheat, and told him about his grandfather Harold, who had homesteaded this land and broken this soil, and built the fence posts that were still solid along the northern edge. James Harold gnawed on her collar and watched the grass move with wide, unblinking eyes that were turning from newborn blue to the dark amber brown of his father's. And she talked to him about the land and the history of it with the seriousness she thought all important things deserved. Clement came to meet them at the edge of the field, and he took the baby easily, the way he had learned to in the months since February, with the confident, matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything, and he settled James Harold against his chest, and the baby immediately grabbed his collar the same way he had grabbed hers, which seemed to be a habit. "He likes the field," Maggie said. "He likes being outside," Clement said. "He's going to be a difficult person to keep indoors." "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets it from both of us," he said, and he was right. That summer she made a decision she had been turning over for some months. She hired a young couple, recently arrived from Missouri, to manage the homestead land full-time, to live in her father's house and work the acreage on a share arrangement that would keep the land productive and the family able. The couple, whose names were Ruth and Daniel Marsh, were in their mid-20s and energetic and grateful, and when she showed them the house and the field and the fence line, she could see Ruth Marsh touching the kitchen window frame with an expression that Maggie recognized, because it was the expression of a woman who was calculating whether a place could become home. "It can," Maggie said. Ruth Marsh looked at her with startled eyes. "The window," Maggie said, smiling. "I was doing the same thing when I first arrived at the Double D," Ruth Marsh laughed, a little embarrassed, a little relieved. "It's a good house," she said. "My father built it," Maggie said. "He would be glad to know it was being used." 3 years passed with the density that the good years always have, full of seasons and work, and the ordinary, extraordinary business of building a life. James Harold walked and then ran and then climbed things that made everyone's heart stop, and he was Clement to the eyes but Maggie in the chin and the will. And he had the rooster blood about mornings and was up before sunrise without exception, standing at the window in his nightshirt, watching the ranch wake up with an expression of profound satisfaction. In the spring of 1882, there was a second baby, another boy, born with considerably less drama and considerably more hair than his brother, whom they named Robert Clarence Donovan. Robert for no particular reason, except that it suited him from the moment he appeared, and Clarence for Clement's late father, whom he had known only briefly before the war had taken him. Robert Clarence was a quiet, watchful baby who seemed to be taking careful notes on everything, and where James Harold was a force of nature, Robert was a steady current, and between the two of them they made a complete complementary picture. Tom Buckley made a second rattle without being asked. The land was thriving. The ranch had expanded from 1,200 to 1,800 acres over the course of 4 years, a careful and considered expansion that Clement had planned before Maggie arrived and executed in the years after, and the Double D cattle were a known quantity at the markets in Wichita. The Marsh family had the homestead producing well, the share arrangement working with the comfortable reliability of a thing that was fair to both parties, and every spring Maggie went out to the field and walked the rows and felt her father's presence in the turned earth. She was standing in that field on a clear October morning in 1882, 4 years to the month from the auction in Caldwell, with Robert Clarence on her hip and James Harold running industrious circles around her legs, when she thought again, as she sometimes did, about that morning and the platform and the crowd of looking eyes and the one man at the far left edge who had not been looking. She had understood it now for years, had known since that February afternoon in the blizzard what the answer was. She had known it was respect, had heard him say it in his careful way, had seen it played out in every subsequent day and year in the way he treated her, not as a possession or a project or a rescued thing, but as a person, complete and capable and worthy of being met on level ground. She had come to know that his not looking was a form of seeing, a refusal to participate in an act of viewing that reduced rather than recognized, and that it had been one of the truest things anyone had ever done for her without her knowing it. She told him this that evening. James Harold was finally asleep, which on a good night happened before 9, and on a bad night happened closer to 10, and Robert Clarence was in his cradle in the second bedroom, and the house was quiet in the way it got after the boys were down, a silence full of the recent presence of small, energetic people. She found Clement on the porch as she often did in the evenings, with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand and his face turned toward the stars. She sat down beside him and said, "I've been thinking about the auction." He looked at her. "Have you?" "4 years ago this month," she said. "I know," he said. It was the kind of thing he would have counted. "I understand why you didn't look," she said. "I've understood for a long time, but I want to tell you what it has meant to me looking back on it, what it continues to mean." He was quiet, waiting, giving her the full attention that was his particular gift. "I spent years turning that question over," she said, "through all of the autumn and the winter and into the spring, asking myself what kind of man stands in a crowd like that and keeps his eyes somewhere else, and then reaches in with the exact right amount of money at the exact right moment. I couldn't understand it because I hadn't seen it before." "Respect," he said, the word he had given her. "Respect," she said. "But I want you to know what that means as a lived thing, not just as a word. It means that from the first moment, before you knew anything about me except that I was in a desperate position, you treated me as someone whose experience of being looked at mattered. You understood that there is a difference between looking and seeing, and that a woman on a platform in that situation has already had enough of being looked at. So you didn't add to it. And I have thought about that so many times, and I want you to know that it was the thing that made everything else possible." He looked at her for a long time. In the starlight she could see the line of his face, the familiar geography of it, the weathered steadiness that she had learned like a second landscape. "I wasn't sure you'd noticed," he said. "I noticed everything," she said. "I was terrified and I had nowhere to look that wasn't worse, and there you were at the edge of the crowd not doing the thing everyone else was doing, and I noticed, and I did not understand it, and I kept not understanding it until you told me, and then I understood it in a way I have never forgotten." "I'm glad," he said, quietly, meaning all of it. "I want to tell James Harold," she said, "when he's old enough. About that morning and about what respect looks like in practice, not in theory. I want him to know it as a story about his parents because stories stick in a way that lessons don't." "He'll be a good man," Clement said. "He already is in the ways that matter." "He is," she agreed. "They both will be. You'll see to it." "We will see to it," he said, with the gentle correction that acknowledged what was equal between them. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the Kansas dark, under those indescribable plain stars that have nothing between them and the earth. And she thought about the girl she had been on that auction platform, rigid with terror and humiliation, trying to hold herself together while the world assessed her worth in cattle and coin. She thought about how far it was from that girl to this woman, on this porch, with this man and these boys asleep inside and this land all around, and she thought that the distance was not so much about time as about the accumulation of moments in which she had been treated as worth the treating. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, the same weight in it, the same steadiness. "I have from almost the beginning." "When?" she asked, because she always liked precision. "About the third morning," he said. "You came into the kitchen and you didn't wait to be shown where things were, you just found them, and you made the coffee before I could ask, and I thought, here is someone who knows how to be in a place." She laughed softly. "That's a very domestic thing to fall in love over." "I'm a very domestic person at heart," he said, and she could feel him smiling. "The cattle are just economics. The kitchen is the thing." "Your mother taught you that," she said. "My mother taught me that," he agreed. The night was very still and very vast and very beautiful, the way October nights are on the Kansas plain when the air has gone crisp and the stars are showing off. An owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, one long questioning note that went unanswered, and then the silence came back thicker and softer. She thought about the title to her land, filed now in the county records under Margaret Elaine Donovan, née Hale, which was her name in full and which she had insisted on keeping both parts of because both parts were who she was. She thought about the Marsh family in her father's house, and about the wheat field her father had first broken, and about Ruth Marsh at the kitchen window calculating whether a place could become home. She thought about Tom Buckley's 2 carved rattles lined up now on the shelf in the nursery. She thought about February blizzards and cribbage, and the word respect said plainly across a table. She thought about how much had happened in 4 years. Not just the events, the marriage and the babies and the land and the seasons, but the quieter accumulation of knowledge about who she was and what she was capable of and what she deserved. She had known some of it before. She had had enough of herself to stand straight on that platform when everything in her wanted to run. But she had not known all of it, had not known the fullness of it, until she had been in the company of someone who had simply, from the first moment, assumed it was all there. The owl called again, and this time something answered, far away across the grass, a small exchange of night sounds in the dark. "Go to bed," Clement said softly, because she was leaning heavier against him and he could tell the difference between her thinking quiet and her almost asleep quiet. She said, which was not agreement. "Maggie," he said, patient and amused. "5 more minutes," she said. "You said that 40 minutes ago," he said. "I had 40 minutes of things to think about," she said. "And now," she considered. The stars were very bright. The house was quiet and warm behind them. Her boys were sleeping the deep sleep of small people who had used every ounce of themselves during the day. Her land was south and east, sleeping under the October sky with the Marsh family in the house that her father had built. The ranch was in good order and the cattle were settled and the winter was 3 weeks away, and all the things that needed doing before it were already planned. "Now I think I'm finished," she said. She turned her face up and he kissed her, there on the porch in the dark, with the Kansas night all around them and the stars watching without judgment. And it was exactly like all the kisses before it and nothing like any of them, the way it always is when you're in the right place. She went inside and he followed, and they checked on the boys as they always did before sleeping, standing in the nursery doorway for a moment in the lamplit dark. James Harold sprawled on his back with one arm flung out, and his face set in the serious expression he wore even in sleep. Robert Clarence curved neat as a comma in his cradle with Tom Buckley's rattle clutched in one small fist. "Good night, James," Clement said softly. James Harold did not wake. He did not need to. There would be morning. She placed her hand on Robert Clarence's back for a moment, feeling the small, steady rise and fall of him, and then she stepped back and Clement pulled the nursery door mostly closed. They stood in the hallway for a moment, just the two of them in the quiet house, the sounds of the ranch night outside and the sleeping children inside, and she looked at him in the dim light and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this man who had stood at the edge of a crowd and refused to be part of something cruel, this man who had bid more than he needed to and asked for nothing in return, this man who had given her gloves and Dickens and his mother's wedding ring and his steadiness and his particular form of seeing that was better than looking, was the most remarkable fact of her life. "Come to bed," she said. "Yes," he said, simple and certain. And the house settled into its nighttime quiet, the plains dark pressing soft and vast against the windows, the stars thick overhead, the land sleeping all around them rich and real and theirs. The spring after that, James Harold found his voice for full sentences, and used them without pause for most of every waking hour, a development that Tom Buckley declared was both a miracle and a challenge, and that Robert Clarence regarded from his more recent upright vantage, with the considering expression of someone taking very detailed notes on a fascinating subject. James Harold's first real question of substance, asked on an April morning with the fresh mud of spring on his boots and his hair standing in 3 directions as usual, was why the fence posts on the north edge were older than the ones on the south. Maggie crouched down to his level with a handful of spring mud still on her glove and said, "Because your grandfather built those ones. Before you were born, before I was married, even before I came here. He planted them in the ground himself and they're still holding." James Harold looked at the old fence posts with 4-year-old seriousness and said, "Was he strong?" "Very strong," she said, "in the ways that matter, like Pa," said James Harold. She looked at her son, this small, fierce person with his father's eyes and her chin, and thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like your father," she said. "Yes, exactly like that." She stood up and brushed the mud from her glove and took his hand, and they walked back toward the house together, where Clement was on the porch with Robert Clarence on his hip and a coffee cup in his other hand, watching the morning come over the grass in the particular way that morning comes over the Kansas plains, slowly and then all at once, the light going from gray to gold in the space of a breath. He looked up when she and James Harold came through the gate and he smiled, the full real one, the one that changed his face entirely. She thought about October 1878 and the bruise-colored sky and the wooden platform and the one man at the far edge of the crowd who had not looked at her face. She thought about how she had spent years wondering why. She thought about what she knew now. She walked through the gate and up the porch steps with her son's hand in hers and her husband's smile waiting for her in the morning light. And she thought that some answers are worth every year it takes to find them, because the finding of them opens onto everything else, and everything else in her case was this. This porch, this man, these boys, this land, this ordinary, extraordinary morning on the Kansas plain, and the long, bright life that was still unspooling ahead of them, season by season, day by good, honest day. She reached up and kissed Clement Donovan on his weathered, familiar cheek and took Robert Clarence from his arm, and the baby grabbed her collar with both fists the way he always did, and James Harold was already telling his father something urgent about the fence posts, and the sun came the rest of the way over the grass in a sweep of gold, and the ranch woke up around them, and everything was exactly as it should be.